do appreciate that. And today, I think before we get started, I think just want to express thanks to the folks who came out here to speak with us today. And we're going to kind of have a dual presentation track here today. So Tim Smith with Board of Water and Soil Resources, along with Carol Strojny, will be here today and are presenting to discuss the current initiatives underway within Bowser regarding the preliminary results from their Floristic quality study and wetland mitigation monitoring that's been underway. And I don't want to get into too much detail about the presentation here, but do want to welcome them here as they provide the presentation to us today. Carol's been with Bowser for 14 years and has been monitoring wetlands restored through conservation programs and for regulatory purposes. Her work includes vegetative restoration planning of wetland mitigation sites and evaluating long-term floristic quality outcomes in wetlands. She received her Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and a master's degree in wildlife ecology from the University of Maine. Tim has served with the Wetland Mitigation Coordinator at the Board of Water and Soil Resources since 2016, and has also had time with the Army Corps of Engineers. And he has wonderful experience with the development, review, and monitoring of aquatic resource mitigation sites throughout the U.S. and is responsible for the state's wetland banking program. So they'll start out with their presentation here today, and then thereafter we'll switch things up after probably a brief intermission and listen to Scott Milburn and his assistant Jesse Schmidt. They'll co-present regarding their ongoing long-term monitoring effort that uses the actual full floristic quality assessment method, FQA, rather than like the rapid FQA that has been used in years past. And we'll look forward to hearing what they have to share with us today here. So yeah, for us to get started here, Carol will get things underway regarding the assessments of the long-term floristic preliminary results and hydrology on wetland mitigation sites.
Thanks.
And then you found the...
Got it clear.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, so as you're probably aware that the PCA and DNR have been doing their statewide quality and quantity assessments for a long time now. And we kind of seen their reports and so forth. We applied for a grant and received it to look at some of the quality of our restored wetlands. So I'm going to be presenting the preliminary results. It's kind of the final preliminary results. We still got more data work to do, so that's why it's preliminary. So our objectives are assessing vegetative condition, determining effectiveness of vegetation restoration efforts, and reviewing the vegetative performance standards versus our longer-term outcomes. On really focusing on mitigation banks, but kind of to see things in context, we're comparing our wetland mitigation banks to passively restored sites, which are from a conservation program that weren't seeded or really managed intensively, and also to naturally occurring wetlands. Our focus area is the southern part of the state, and depressional wetlands. We didn't want to mix things up too much with like organic flats or floodplains, so we really went in on the depressional wetlands, and it's kind of limited to the southern part because at the time of the study, that's where the NWI was updated, which helped us with the randomization and selecting sites. So I mentioned there's those three populations that we're looking at. The intensive is what we're calling the wetland banks. In other words, there's like kind of more effort put into restoring them. And then there's passively restored, which is a subset of the conservation program, RIM. There are sites in the conservation programs that are seeded and more intensively restored, but we kind of picked on the ones that were just naturally revegetated, but still had hydro restoration. So in these, for restoration sites, we wanted them to be about 7 to 15 years old, kind of to get some distance between that final annual monitoring requirement and when we look at them, so for a longer term outlook. but not going way so far back where they didn't do seeding as much or management of the bases. And then the naturally recurring wetlands, they're not your reference wetlands as much as they're just, they haven't been drained, restored, or created in the landscape, or farmed, recently farmed. So I did want to point out that we did a randomization for selection. We did look at all the wetland banks that we had, which ended up being, I think, 34 after things were looked at. But this is one bank that's over 100 acres, but we looked at one of those basins within it, which happened to be 2 acres or so. So we weren't, at some place that was reporting, like we had these 2 or 3 acre sites, and they're like, what do you mean, a wetland bank that's only 3 acres? And it's just part of our process of randomly selecting and keeping a distance between, so we didn't have like too much relationship. Like if we picked 3 of those basins, they kind of went through the same process. So we're just trying to keep things independent that way. Our field survey method followed really closely what MPCA has done with their meander, a timed meander. Our assessment area is like this blue line here, which is, we tried to make it the wetland basin edge. We would, as we were doing the time meander or before or after, kind of map out the communities. This would be like a shallow open water area, shallow marsh. Shallow marsh, deep marsh, we pretty much called things shallow marsh if it was like a cattail mat or that emergent vegetation. Even if the water was deeper or a floating matter. And then this pink area is like a fresh wet meadow. And so with this method, we wrote down all the species observed, and each of those species has a coefficient of conservatism assigned. For example, 3 canary grass is a 0 because it's not native and invasive, so it gets a 0 versus like a lake sedge is a 5, and pickerel is higher than 8. So all those species observed have a coefficient of conservatism assigned. Sometimes the upland species might like creep down, and it just got kicked out of the analysis because it didn't have coefficient of conservatism. And then I mentioned we used a time meander, but for like these deeper water areas where it wasn't really safe to meander around, we would use a shoreline sample, which again MPCA had developed. So at 3 different points in the wetland, which are these crosses here, we would toss out three times kind of in a 45-degree angle from each other to rake in the vegetation and see what was there and make estimates of cover. So we would, this formula here, this is the coefficient conservatism, and then P is like the proportion. So basically each species, we look at that coefficient and multiply it times its relative percent cover and sum it up to get a weighted C value. And the MPC developed this table of condition scores based on that weighted C value. So this is what we use to determine condition scores for sites and for communities. So in this example here, at those 3 communities, different scores, fair, poor, fair. We looked at how large they were. So those like 2.1 end up being fair when you look it up in the table. We look at the proportions within the whole assessment area, and then we come up with a site value for that, which in this case is poor. Makes sense because the shallow open water is the largest proportion, and not shallow marsh, right? Shallow marsh, which is the poor, and so the whole site ends up being poor. So for our analyses, we're interested at the site level, kind of to compare it to what MPCA has found out for their statewide assessments. But we also wanted to look at it by community. When you're restoring wetlands, often it's community-based with performance criteria and so forth. And we also wanted to look at some of these values, like the weighted C value, native species richness, and percent cover introduced species, again, related to performance criteria. So, getting into results, we looked at the intensively restored sites that we had, and looked at the different size classes, because we didn't want to end up randomly selecting like 40 3-acre basins from one population and being compared it to like 20-acre basins and so forth. So we want to kind of balance our sizes. And so we did achieve that fairly well across the 3 populations. And everything again was based off of what was our population of most interest, the bank sites. And then we also looked at community acres across those 3 populations, and it's somewhat similar. We had one little deep marsh sliver in the naturally occurring wetlands. And so this is kind of spatially, you can see it results. A lot of fair and poor, which matches what we saw from the NTCA on their condition analyses. A couple good in the naturally occurring wetlands. And this is at the site level. And then now we'll be showing a couple charts and bar graphs and so forth. So this is condition class by site. We see that the intensively restored sites, bank sites, are doing better than the passively restored sites, which hence that doing some kind of seeding and management has positive outcomes for condition. And we're similar to the naturally occurring wetlands as far as proportions go. So then we start, well, what's going on at the community level? What's really driving that result? So first we look at shallow open water. Again, this is one of those communities that only has, based on limited data, 2 condition scores as an outcome, good or fair. And we don't see any difference proportionally among the 3 populations there. And this is also one that we could, sometimes it was done by meander, but I would say most of the time we used a rake sampling. And we're also questioning, like, are we really getting good data with that versus what a meander would show? So I'll have to get into that. This is just a chart showing the similarity of the weighted C values, again, number of native species among the populations. I'll be showing a bunch of box plots. And if you're not familiar, that's the median value, not the average. And then like the 50% of the data is in that box in the middle. And then it just kind of shows the variability of the whole population and how compressed it is compared to the other ones. So getting back to the 2 methods, we had picked the number of sites that we could get a canoe into. And over here you can see there's a rake. We could put the tape together, made a double-headed rake to like dip into the water and pull up vegetation with. And we would meander within the same basin that someone else independently would go out and do that shoreline sampling with using the fork. And so we compared those numbers and really found a lot of similarity. We only did 8 sites. It's kind of limited in time, and then also sites that you can actually get a canoe into without dragging it through hundreds and hundreds of feet of cattail. But we had similar species richness overall, and it really wasn't one directional. With a t-test, there was only one significant difference in total cover. But sometimes, so total cover was regular and higher for doing the meander, but these kind of flip back and forth as far as one method having more or less. And then the unvegetated estimate I found was pretty similar, which was kind of interesting. So I think what's happening with the weighted C values being so similar is that the total cover, when it's converted to a relative cover, it's similar enough with proportions and coming out with a similar condition score and so forth. So we're pretty confident. I mean, it's only 8 sites, but we feel better about that data and it being representative of the site. So getting into the shallow marsh, here we found that there is a significant difference from our wetland bank or intensively restored sites from naturally occurring sites. And it's not in the direction we'd like to see it. We'd like to see them looking better or the same. But we have a lot more poor condition scores coming off of those wetland banks of that age category. So, and just, it's not really clear here. We have to look at the outliers and kind of see a little bit if those are true outliers or not and so forth, and do some more analyses to see where the differences are. But in general, these seem to be a little bit more compressed, the wetland bank sites, as far as where the bulk of the data is, and that's probably resulting, kind of driving those condition scores. So fresh wet metal is where it's at. You can see definitely this is what we'd like to see. We got a lot more in the fair condition score than the poor, the grays, the poor. So that's looking good. It's better than both the naturally occurring and the passively restored sites. So that was good to see. And then with these box plots, it's that same trend. We got higher overall weighted C value, which is what the condition score is based on. And then, of course, native species and percent cover factors into condition as well, but individually you can see that it's higher for native species and lower for percent cover introduced. But a lot of variability yet. So kind of switching gears a little bit, we modeled our study heavily after what the PCA has done, and they have looked at, have this tool to look at the human disturbance factors. So we looked at these 5 factors, but kind of focused mostly on landscape alteration within 500 meters, the immediate upland alteration within 50 meters, and presence or increase of invasive species. And then all those factors get a rating of minimal to severe based on criteria that's outlined in the guidance. So the first, landscape alteration, we saw that the intensively restored sites and the passively restored were really kind of similar in their proportions, which makes sense because the lightest color yellow is like the minimally impacted, and these restored sites, it was either an incentive or a requirement that they were in agricultural production before they went into the program, so they were pretty disturbed landscapes. So it would be unlikely for us to see the minimally disturbed landscape. As far as the immediate upland, again, the restored wetlands on the edges here had similar as far as the portion of the pie that's a low disturbance, and that probably has to do with the buffer requirement for these programs. So that's within 50 meters of the basin. And then the naturally occurring had a higher proportion of the severe because there is no buffer requirement for those that we found. Unless they happen to be in WMA or something. And then looking at invasive species, it kind of follows what we saw with like the wet meadow, and that there was just a lower proportion of severe for the intensively restored wetlands. So what does this mean and what are we thinking about? So these results indicate that there are positive outcomes driven by that wet meadow community. This picture here is just one that we had been at over the last 3 years, and this is Canada blue joint here, a patch here, there's reed canary grass here. Back here there's like I'm pretty sure it's lake sedge, maybe some river bulrush. They did some plugs kind of at the edge of the basin as well as the emergent mix. And then back here is like this wall of cattail. And we would see that, we would see evidence that the species are persisting. So some of those practices are helping. There's some factors that we're pretty sure are limiting the outcomes with floristic quality. For example, we looked at that wet meadow seed mix and kind of did a scenario where we thought would be like proportions and come up with a weighted C value, and it was really hard to come up with a fair or a good condition. You kind of got fair out of it. Just the nature of the seed mix was made to be competitive and resilient to conditions. So and affordable as well. So those C values don't tend to get too high in the seed mixes. For the fresh or the shallow marsh, in that time period, often what we were seeing was just that 10-foot band seeded with the emergent mix around the basin or the outlet, where the outlet level would be. So sometimes we'd be out in the field and we'd see a 10-foot band of good vegetation and then a wall of cattail. So that was not too surprising. And then, so that's that limited planting zone for the emergent mix. And then one thing we haven't looked at yet is extensive management. A lot of them at that time period were kind of periodic. I think they were focusing more on Canada thistle and sometimes reed canary grass, but cattail in that time period was not very often addressed at all. And I think it is in the plans more often nowadays. So future directions for our intensively restored sites, we're gonna keep looking at those establishment management methods and see how it's relating to our outcomes that we see. And just see if we can look at other explanatory factors, including age of the restoration, construction methods. Most of these were done by embankments, tile breaking, and outlet, but there's a little bit of variability in there. Maybe we can see some trends there. And then for the future, so this map on the left shows what we've done with this study, with this grant. And now we have another grant that we received for 2 years of monitoring. And we propose to kind of extend this effort statewide, but focusing only on wetland banks. So we won't be doing the conservation program or naturally occurring wetlands. So this year we're thinking of doing a bunch of sites, kind of focusing on the organic flat, maybe some more depressional. And there might be some floodplains, organic flats in there too. So we're trying to just spread it out and get some additional data. And then all of this data we can use for long-term trend analyses as well. So we had, each season we had a different field assistant, so they were critical for our data collection. And thank you for the interagency advisory team. And eventually they will get a copy of the final draft to look at. And I guess any questions, I'll leave it on that slide. And I'll be here after Tim talks as well if you think of questions later, but we thought maybe we'd take questions now and then use it if we had to. Yes?
I more of like a observation is, you kind of touched on it or danced around it, but didn't really directly address it, is that with regard to management and duration, frequency of management, post-restoration,
Right.
and that kind of taper of sea value and species richness that will invariably happen once even native perennials take over and these conservative things drop out. And it just doesn't, it didn't seem to really address the reality of that you're looking at these kind of as a snapshot in time and not factoring in how long has it been since the site was restored, which you did mention.
Yeah, there'll be some looking at that.
But then with that, does it have a long-term management strategy or regime in place? And what is that? Is it hydrologic? Is it prescribed fire? Is it more holistic over the whole basin or specific to individual, reed canary grass or thistle or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would say most of these, we don't have, we don't even have annual monitoring reports for all of them back in that time frame.
Yeah.
But we're guessing that most of them don't do long-term management of the vegetation. It's more cleaning out their outlet structures, more of a structural investment and so forth. And maybe with thistle again in the uplands. People are very excited about thistle. But trying to think. I think there were at least 2 where the landowners or developments invested in someone to come out and take care of cattails so that the water would continue to flow. There was a development, they wanted the water to keep flowing well. And the other was the landowner that just really was like their project and wanted to keep looking nice, but we're not sure, because that landowner since sold it, so we're not sure if they again focused on upland or did some into the wetland or not. So I would say hardly anything on cattail for that time period.
Yeah.
Except for that one site, for sure.
Looking at the metrics for the wet meadow, which is probably your best example of kind of having a good distribution of fair and even some good, that it didn't seem like you had really referenced wetland conditions for wet meadow, like the species diversity average or mean was pretty low. Your weighted mean C was around 2, I think, if I remember seeing it. That's really that's really low. I mean,
Yeah, and it's not surprising seeing the MPCA results as well.
Yeah.
There's just not that many reference wetlands in the southern part of the state.
but I think part of that is it's the agricultural landscape or the urban landscape and this stagnation of the landscape, lack of fire, lack of natural disturbance regimes, which really favors this high diversity reference condition that I think we ought to be designing for in our banks. So I think it's maybe a missed opportunity.
Yeah. A number of sites there is, willows coming in, and it was like, well, is this still a wet meadow, or is it becoming a shrub car? And well, I think the depressional setting said, well, it's a very disturbed wet meadow, or undisturbed.
Yeah.
I guess that's the way to say, like, because it's not going through its normal, what it should be for its existence, I guess, so. Other thoughts, ideas? Get it in while you can, the final report's not out.
I was just thinking on that note, it might be interesting to look at like the catchment and kind of the hydraulic, how long and the kind of severity of flooding duration that you might have and how influential that might be on some of the diversity, because that would be one example of disturbance that might persist.
Yeah, that had come up at the beginning of the study, and we weren't quite sure, like, how would, like, position in the catchment, or, yeah, like, what factors to look at, but that would be interesting. I'm a grad student looking for a project.
I'd like to point out at the beginning, we're kind of in a unique situation here in Minnesota, because we have the ability as a regulatory agency, for the most part, to go back and look at these things long-term and look at how the program's functioning and what goals we're achieving or not achieving with wetland replacement, which is unusual in a regulatory context. And I've worked in wetland regulation for 20-some years now, and this is the first time we've ever been able to go back and look at how well are we performing in detail outside of just permitting. So we can actually go back now and look at some of these mitigation projects and really get some feedback on how well are we doing with these. So it's interesting. You'll notice we seem to have a good track record getting EPA grants, which we're at times proud of, and at times questioning why we continue to apply for EPA grants, because the complexities, tangled webs involved with reporting on federal grants. But all in all, it's a good thing. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing with hydrology. So Carol had focused on some of the work we're doing with vegetative quality, and we also thought at some point while she was implementing that grant that we would take a look at wetland hydrology if we had the chance as well. So we partnered with DNR to submit a grant application to EPA, and were awarded the grant. And it really has two parts, the part that DNR is implementing and the part that Bowser is implementing. And DNR is focusing primarily on establishing a wetland hydrology reference network. So that'll be a statewide system that they're going to put in wells across the state in various landscape positions. And they're going to continually record wetland hydrology data to use as a reference for whoever has a use for it. So primarily, I think their interest initially was involved with some appropriation permitting and water withdrawals, that they really needed some better information on wetland hydrology. It also can be a great resource for those of us who restore wetlands or look at other types of wetland impacts, that we would have that information available to us. So, and they're part of the study. They are establishing 20 locations this year, actually 2019. I think they got about 13 to 15 of them installed, so they're collecting data some of last year, and then they'll finish doing all their installations this year, and they'll have that part of the network set up and have that data coming in. So our part of it was to go in and look at some of our wetland bank sites using really the same approach that Carol described for the vegetative quality, is to look at these sites that were restored 7 to 15 years ago and go back and look at hydrology and really assess, I think what we refer to as resiliency. So that's the ability of these wetlands or that restored hydrology to sustain itself once we get through that intensive establishment and management period. So I think we take for granted at times that the restoration work that we do, once we hit the end of that 5-year monitoring period, that these sites are all set and that they're on a good trajectory. And And I think those of us at Bowser aren't entirely convinced that that's the case, and we wanted to see some information to suggest that we are hitting those targets. So some information there from an EPA study coming out on monitoring some nationwide efforts they're making about exactly what resiliency is. You can read those bullets real quick, but essentially we're looking at how tough are these systems long-term at dealing with climate and other changes to their landscape or their drainage area in terms of the work that we did on the site to restore that hydrology. So the area that we're working in, again, mimics a lot of what Carol did. We did that intentionally because we wanted to try and combine the results from these two studies to get at sort of that whole picture of what's going on at these restored sites. So I mentioned 7 to 15 years since construction. Ideally, we wanted sites that had post-construction hydrology monitoring data, which if you were involved in the program 7 to 15 years ago was hit or miss, and a lot of times there's people reading staff gauges. Once a month was how we evaluated hydrology. Does everybody remember those days? There's a lot of young faces in here that may not realize that. So it was in a juvenile state 7 to 15 years ago, so there wasn't a lot of intensive hydrology monitoring work done, which made our population that we selected sites from a little bit smaller than what Carol was working with from a vegetative standpoint. And then we'll be collecting hydrology data for 3 growing seasons. We got all of our wells in last season. We didn't get a full year from all those wells, but we got a decent set. We may talk to EPA about going an extra year so we can have 3 full growing seasons. So the area that we're looking at, those are our sites. Again, similar area to what Carol's working with. Actually, I think there's an overlap with about 50% of the sites that we're looking at as part of our study. She also included in her study. And with those that weren't included in the veg study, we're going out to our sites for the hydrology study, collecting the same vegetation data. So we'll have a complete set of vegetation and hydrology data for each of these sites. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through what we did at one of these sites, give you an idea of kind of the data we're gathering and what things are looking like. And we've done a lot of data mining over the past year, and so we only have, in most cases, a partial growing season hydrology data set, but I thought it'd be interesting to share with you some of the other things that we're pulling up to look at this stuff. So this is a Menard site in Lyon County, out here in Marshall. We just put a well in at one spot in their basin. We actually got that one in fairly early, so we've got a good, almost a full season of hydrology. So some of the comparative things we're doing, we're able to go back and look at precip data from 2019, which was last year, the first year we monitored, and then also compare it with precip data for the year that the first full growing season after the site was constructed, which is 2009. And then we can also go look at, on the left is their data logger information for that first full growing season after construction. And then on the right there is our first year monitoring hydrology. It's actually a fairly similar graph if you're able to figure out where the start and end points are, because they started a little bit earlier than we did. We started in mid-June, so if you can line up, actually I could probably point that out to you. So their starting point over here was a little bit earlier in the growing season. If you go into June, about the mid part of June, and then you compare that with what we have here, they're fairly similar graphs, even though in terms of precip they're a little bit different. We didn't go back and do a lot of plotting their historical data for this one yet. In terms of some of the other things, we've been playing around with how you can do comparative analysis of these data sets. So one of the things that Eric Mooring in our office is preparing is we just started looking at some, I call them descriptive statistics about that data. But if you look at, we have, for instance, a different site, the Strojny site in Wright County. Is it Wright County, Carol? It's Wright County.
Yeah.
But they monitored that site from 2009 to 2013. We were able to get wells in out there in 2019. And then when you look at some of the data, it's a little bit difficult from a comparative standpoint to really do an assessment of this. So we were throwing together some of the things that, some data that we were looking at and ways of doing it. If some of you have heard Ken Powell present recently, he's real big on this coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation divided by the mean for a particular data set, which is an interesting series of values here.
for what we're looking at, but there are some, this is a really low number, which makes sense when you look at the box plot there, because it's a pretty narrow range of data. So we're exploring some other ways of looking at that. We have a lot of data to go through and a lot of different methods to evaluate. So we'll keep doing that as we collect data. Ultimately, we're going to present a number of options for looking at this to really assess how's the site behaving currently versus how it behaved during the initial monitoring period. The other thing we're looking at in terms of both hydrology and vegetation is we are pulling out the mapping that was done for vegetative communities from monitoring reports. That is the 2009, so after the first full growing season. This one is, I think it's at the end, yeah, 2014, so that's at the, like a final monitoring report. And then we did go out and map things too as part of our study this past year. So on this particular site, things look relatively kind of constant from the initial first growing season after construction. Things were very similar then, and then you can see here, the only real difference is that we mapped the shallow and deep marsh altogether on that site. Just a little difference in how you make distinctions between plant communities, but the thing we were primarily looking at was the band of fresh wet meadow around the outside, and it's fairly consistent through each of those maps. So just another piece of data that we're looking at will be included in the report. So some of the questions we're really looking at answering with this in terms of program reflection. Was the hydrology documented during the establishment period sustainable beyond that period? So we have our performance standards. When we release a site for monitoring hydrology, what happens to that site 7 to 15 years after that construction period? Does a comparison of short and long-term data from the restored sites tell us anything about assessing the amount of time required to restore wetland hydrology? So are we monitoring this for the right amount of time? And are we really seeing the things that we can rely on for being long-term indicators? Number 3, if there are changes in the wetland plant communities at the site, is there also a change in hydrology? I think that ties in with some of the work Carol's doing. I think Jason kind of mentioned it too, is if you do have changes out there in plant communities, are they a result of some other change that we may see represented in a change in hydrology? And then are the monitoring requirements and performance standards currently being used representative of long-term resilient condition of the site? So are we hitting the target in terms of the requirements we're putting on bank sponsors? Anybody here work in Wisconsin from a banking standpoint? The Wisconsin, the state agencies and federal agencies are moving towards or using a 3-year requirement before they release any credits for hydrology performance at a site. So here in Minnesota, we've been using 2, and we actually had discussions with the Corps last year about allowing at least a partial hydrology release after 1 year if you met some sort of interim hydrology standard. And that didn't go over that well. So you won't be seeing anything short of 2 years here in Minnesota, but it is sort of a reflection of the programmatic approach to this hydrology issue. They're convinced that they need to look at longer periods for hydrology monitoring just across the state line, where we're sticking to the 2-year one. So future directions, change gears a little bit. As you can probably tell from Carol's presentation and also some of the other work that we're doing, we're pulling together a lot of data. And Minnesota is viewed nationally as being a state that's very progressive with its wetland program, both from a regulation standpoint and also from a banking standpoint. So we were asked to participate in an EPA-funded study done by the Environmental Law Institute with some other partners to look at ways to help the states nationwide gather data on mitigation site performance and store that data and make that data available to others who may be interested in that data. So right now, I think it's even here in Minnesota, we have tons of data that's collected. We have a lot of sites, there's a lot of monitoring. What happens to that data? I can tell you when it comes into us, it gets either put into a file or it gets stored electronically somewhere, and it's never all put together or stored in one place. So in terms of somebody wanting to pull that data out later on to look at things, we're not able to respond to any of those requests. So EPA recognized that as a national issue, and they funded a study to do it. And they have a report coming out that largely looks at a modular approach to assist states and tribes with collecting and organizing data and really evaluating mitigation sites. So this is kind of a bigger picture approach, but one of the other things that's associated with this is also the development of a way to manage that data. So the EPA approached us about potentially being a pilot study, nationwide pilot study, to develop a way to take monitoring data stored electronically in sort of geospatial format, and then be able to push that data back out to users who want to gather information that's been put into the system. So we were selected to participate in the study, and it worked out well for us because if you haven't heard, we are in the process of developing a new wetland banking database. We had our kickoff meeting with our vendor last week, and so we're now actively developing a new database to replace the current wetland banking one. And we decided with this funding from EPA and the pilot study that one of the modules of the banking database will be this data management system. So ultimately, from a schematic standpoint, our database is not only going to handle transaction data, but we're going to have a web-based interface where monitoring data can be submitted in a standardized format into us, and it will be stored, and then it can be accessed for folks outside who may want to go and look at certain data from certain parts of the state. So you'll be able, through the GIS geospatial interface, to go look at sites that have information and pull that data back out. So all the sites that Carol's monitored, ultimately we hope to get all that data put in so that if you folks would ever want it, you can go in and select what types of data you want, and you'll be able to pull that back out. So just some basic information about the way it's constructed, but the bottom line is that it will be sort of a public portal to be able to access all this data that's being collected, and that's both the public and other agency staff. So really the goal is to go from the disorganized file cabinet to having some sort of managed database where all that information is available. And we're hoping that we're about a 12-month time frame, we're hoping to have something out there that will be used. And I'll stop there and take questions. Yes?
Unrelated to this, where's the in lieu fee program at? You could update on that.
Let me answer questions on this first, and if there are none, I'll go right to the in lieu fee, but in lieu fee can take over the rest of the time. And any other questions on this type of stuff? Yeah, Jason?
I think that being able to upload data is interesting and share it and compile it in a standardized way. How are you going to address the performance standards and the monitoring protocols site by site can be so different from one bank to the next? I mean, so is there going to be a standardization of that, or who's going to standardize those data and enter them into a format that can be compiled and shared?
That's a really good question. Initially, we're developing the data management system to really receive and store condition data like we're collecting now. So we recognize that very issue when we started, that monitoring of bank sites, there's all kinds of stuff that's being done. Our thought was initially, and we haven't officially pitched this to anyone yet, would be that for wetland bank sites, what would be really useful is at the end of the monitoring period, if we did have a standard way of documenting condition. And everybody did that as a part of their final report, or their final delineation. They turned in the same type of information Carol's gathering about quality or condition. And then we would have a baseline at the end of the monitoring period from them which to assess that site over time. So I don't think we initially looked at it as a way of storing all the data that comes in during the monitoring period because of the variability with what people are doing. We may look at going that way, but it would require some standardization across wetland banking in the state. And I don't know that we're going to push that too hard right now. So hydrology data, I think we're definitely interested in getting that in because there's already a process in the state to handle that. And we may just piggyback on that. I don't know that they're willing to accept all the data that we might generate for that, but that's certainly an option. But initially, we're going to primarily focus on condition data, which would be hopefully getting a baseline at the end of that required monitoring period. And then as we go forward in time, looking at sites like we're doing now, we would build that data into it.
What would be an example of a vegetation condition methodology, or post-restoration at the end?
Same stuff Carol's doing.
So it would be a metric like a weighted EC, or or a high, medium, low, or something like that?
It'd probably be the mean C stuff that we're doing, yeah.
Yeah, and those numbers can change, I don't know if there'll be future iterations of the FQA, so having that full species list will help keep it to the future.
There is a little bit of a problem right now where MinRam is still a thing, but it's like nobody's really supporting it, or it's not very strong methodology, especially for vegetation, but there's nothing to really replace it officially for vegetation. Is there any movement towards Bowser trying to develop and adopt FQI or something similar?
Not officially, no. No. I think what we wanted to focus on with the data management system was getting survey data in, so that if the desired metric in the future changed, at least we had data from the site that we might be able to use with that. So that was the primary focus, was getting the results of a time meander or a plot or something like that into the system so that the data's there. So if we decided through time we wanted to look at it different ways, we had all the raw data, you could pull that out and work with. So we weren't so much concerned about the metric as getting the data.
Any other questions before I jump to ILF? No? So your question was the status of the ILF?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm assuming it's all right if I answer this? I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'll be real quick.
Yeah, 1 2 minutes.
Okay. So, as you know, we were working on the CPF for 7, and that's pretty much done. So the compensation planning framework for Bank Service Area 7, which is a requirement for the ILF to operate in that area. So we have 2 CPFs that are essentially done now for the St. Croix BSA 6 and then Middle Mississippi 7. The thing that slowed us down at this point is the program instrument, which is the main part that needs to be submitted to the Corps. And the problem we're having with that is the program account, which is the money part of the ILF, which you have to have all your books open to the Corps at any time. Because of the source of funds for our program, which is bonding money, there's all kinds of limitations on what you can do with bonding money. And things as simple as, if we were to use an advanced credit, we have to take that money and move it into an account and show that that money's there. Because of the way bonding funds are managed by the state, that's hard to do from an accounting standpoint. Because we have certain things, if we want to move bonding money and tie it up with some project, we have to do that via a purchase order. I just can't take bonding money and move it into another account. That's not allowed. So I have to find a way to show that that money's been put in a proper place and is dedicated towards those credits. So we're kind of in this long accounting discussion with our fiscal staff about how best we can show the money trail through the ILF program. It's confounded a little bit because we are probably the only ILF or proposed ILF in the country where we are the ILF sponsor and will also be the primary user. So we're essentially selling credits to ourselves, and that creates a problem with money management because the transaction isn't us actually going and buying something and having a financial transaction. We're just moving money around between accounts, and bonding money is difficult to do with that. So it's probably a snore answer for you because it's really doesn't make sense to me, because to me I'm like, smooth the money over here, do this and show it here, but we can't do it that way. So we've had to engage some people outside our agency at the state to really work out how we can demonstrate that the money's actually moving in the right spots and then is accessible for those advanced credit paybacks that have to happen. There's also some other money-related things that, for example, when you do ILF, a small amount of the money that you collect for when you sell an advanced credit, a small amount of the money can be used for administrative costs of operating the in lieu fee program. That is not an allowable expense with bonding money. So the bonding money received from the state has to go towards acquisition of a capital asset for the state.
And that administrative cost is not allowed. You're not allowed to take the bonding money and use it to run your program. That's not allowed. So that causes some hiccups in terms of how things work and how you split money up in that. So again, it goes back to the restrictions on bonding funds and what you can use that for. And is that a real good fit to move around inside an ILF? So, long answer, sorry, but it's mainly a program instrument delay at this point with working out funding issues, which is something we didn't really anticipate when we got started with this. But we're hoping to have that wrapped up in the next month or so. Any other questions?
You want to do a teaser on the?
Oh,
Okay.
yes, thank you for reminding me. So while I'm closing this down, we wanted to do a little heads up that we are very close to releasing, it's not going to be just one RFP now, it's going to be several, for the road program. So we will have 3 options available for folks to participate. The easement sign-up, which is one that we've done in the past, which essentially we pay a landowner for a conservation easement, and then we go develop the project. There will be a second option, which is what we used to call contract for credits, but what we're now calling third-party projects, where it's at the other end of the continuum, where somebody would submit in response to our RFP, submits a proposal to us, and if we accept that, they are responsible for going and doing the project and delivering the credits to us, and we pay them for the easement and the credits as they're deposited into their account. And then the third option is a partnership, which is right in the middle, where we sit down and negotiate how things are going to be split up. So those 3 options are going to be out there for the road program, and the RFP will be almost statewide. There are a couple areas we won't be looking for credits, but there will be a lot that we are, and we're also going to be doing some projects for MnDOT, so some funding from them is included. And then the other thing I'll mention is that we also have funds from MnDOT to do direct credit purchases. So if you guys are managing wetland bank accounts, there will be an RFP for us to buy credits directly from your account. And that is going to be, let me see if I can remember this, bank service areas 4, 5, 7, 9, and I think 2's in there as well. So that's probably within the next month that's going to go out. So it's a lot of activity. There's probably, right now, with our money and MnDOT's money, we're probably looking at close to 8 or 9 million worth for those. And if the legislature comes through and follows up with the governor's request, the road program can get another 26 million this year, I think. So a lot on the horizon for the road program. Thank you.